Welcome to Keeping Legal Minds Intact, Mitigating Compassion Fatigue Among Legal Professionals, co-sponsored by the ABA Commission on Lawyer Assistance Programs, Tort, Trial, and Insurance Practice Section, Commission on Law and Aging, Standing Committee on Legal Aid and Indigent Defendants, SOLO, Small Firm and General Practice Division, and the ABA Center for Professional Development. Moderating the program today is Linda Albert. Linda is the manager of the Wisconsin Lawyers Assistance Program with the State Bar of Wisconsin, located in Madison, Wisconsin. Linda, please proceed with today's program.
Thank you, Tammy. Joining me today is Deborah Smith and Dr. Gregory Van Rybroek. After more than 30 years of working as a public defender, Deb is currently retired, but she remains active with the State Bar of Wisconsin, particularly the Lawyer Assistance Program, as well as the Inns of Court and the Dane County Bar Association. She is located in Middleton, Wisconsin. Dr. Van Rybroek is the director of the Mendota Mental Health Institute and the Mendota Juvenile Treatment Center. He is also an active member of the Lawyer Assistance Program and is located in Madison, Wisconsin. Today we're going to be talking about mitigating compassion fatigue amongst legal professionals. And our seminar objectives are to give you an understanding of what compassion fatigue is, the signs and symptoms that you or a colleague may be experiencing, how this type of condition gets connected to ethical violations, and what we need to be looking at in regards to the prevention of ethical violations, and most importantly, understanding the best practices for prevention and mitigation of compassion fatigue. The next slide is a short video to introduce you to this topic.
Here's to you, trying to make the world a better place. You take on the weight of it all, knowing there will be a cost, but never expecting to pay full retail for it. After a while, you notice something's getting to you. You're changing. You've been there. We've all been there. The answers just aren't all that easy anymore. Now you're too drained for even the smallest demands. You're numb. You feel like you can't do enough, and you've needed a nap since before the turn of the century. Maybe you're a school teacher, a public defender, or a member of the military. So why does the world feel like a different place to you? Maybe you're an ecologist, a doctor, a community organizer, or a caretaker to family members. It's all piling on, and some of your own choices could be starting to raise eyebrows. Let's face it, these days, when the world comes calling, you'd really rather not pick up. Your mind, blown. Your spirit, broken. And your body is not taking any of this all that well. Something's just not how you remember. And that something could, in fact, be you. Hey, it's a struggle. We understand that. Doesn't mean it's too late for a change. We're here. We get it. And we have ideas for how to find a better way. Check us out. TraumaStewardship.com.
So today we're going to take a look at how maybe we can do it in a better way, figuring out what it is that impacts us, how we're impacted by the work that we do, and what are the best ways to stay well. We're going to start out now. Take a look at this slide and pick a word or two to fill in the blanks. And then I want you to either write them down, or if you are under 40, maybe you can remember them for the 10, 20-minute rule. But if not, I would write them down because we're going to come back to them later and do a little reflecting on it. So the world is what kind of place? Just pick a word or two. Life is what? I am blank. as a human being? I want to change this about my job, about myself. And here's probably the most important one. What feeling is it that you walk around with? Most often I feel blank. All right, so take note of those. We'll come back to them. When we look at compassion fatigue and its definition, we're really not talking about an event. We're not talking about a specific disease. We're talking about a cumulative condition that affects us physically and emotionally and psychologically due to being exposed to other people's traumatic or distressing stories or events. At the same time that you are working as an attorney in a helping capacity where the demands outweigh the resources. So when I dumb it down, I say, it's doing too much for too long with too few resources while you're working with the big uglies in life. And the important thing is to remember that when we end up with symptoms of compassion fatigue, or we may struggle with this, it's really because we are human. It doesn't imply weakness or lack of intelligence or we're just not tough enough. It's because we're human and that any person, regardless of race or gender, ethnicity, can be at risk. So it's much more about a dis-ease than it is a disease. And one of the things that we looked at, in our study, and Deb's going to talk more explicitly about this later, is really what are the contributions? And so we really encourage attorneys to take a look at what all is on my plate. What am I facing with not just work, but everything in my life? Because there was statistically a significant correlation with workload overall and compassion fatigue. So attorneys taking on a lot, doing a lot, feeling like they don't have enough time for their social and their leisure time and activities that replenish and restore them. So we look at that piece. We look at your individual vulnerabilities. So if this is your screen, your blank screen of life, and you start kind of throwing things on it, what do you have going on in your life? What is all on your plate? Whether it's taking care of a parent, your children, your partner, someone have health problems, do you have health problems? Are there alcohol or drug issues or mental health issues? Or work is just at a time when way too much work for the amount of resources and time to do it. So I encourage you as we go through this to really think about what are all the things specifically on your plate that can form together to impact you as a human being. Think about your clients. I mean, at most times attorneys talk about clients having unrealistic expectations, wanting, their attorney to be available 24 hours of the day, wanting it now. A lot of unhappiness, sad, mad, frustrated, give it to me now, not understanding why the attorney can't, move mountains through the legal system for them. So a lot of stress from the pressure, from the expectations of clients. And then we add on to that the stress from this difficult material that gets reviewed during the workload of an attorney. And yet you are expected to just continue to roll on and be unaffected by your cases and take the next one and do the job and, continue to function as if nothing impacts you. The other dynamic that attorneys talk a lot about is the adversarial nature of law. It's the toothbrush and the toilet paper. I mean, who has it worse? You're trying to, bargain the deal. You're trying to get the opposing counsel to be reasonable. You're trying to work with your client. And there's all this adversarial nature of law that has an impact on you as a human being. So for most attorneys, it's really a balancing act, right? There really isn't any balance. It's on a daily basis that you're having to negotiate balance and make changes and work with this. So it's high pressure, low decision latitude, correlation with compassion fatigue. So let's take a look specifically about how does it develop? What are the neurobiological changes that happen with us as human beings? And what are some of the cognitive changes that we need to be alerted to so that we can evaluate whether or not this is something that we need to address and make some needed accommodations in our life? It all starts with the ability of our brains to empathize with other human beings. So this is where we have a shared emotion, and this is hardwired into our brains. You don't really have the choice of whether or not you empathize because it is something that we're born with, the ability to do. The important piece of this, though, is to note that human beings who spend time with other human beings who are empathetic tend to feel better. They have a higher level of health and wellness overall. So when you think about it, do you have those people in your life who get you? Not that feel sorry for you, but those people who understand the difficulty of the work that you do, the demands of the client. If you are a prosecutor, a public defender, a criminal defense lawyer, family law, bankruptcy law, whatever type of law where you have exposure to other people's really traumatic events and distressing stories, it's important that you spend time with other human beings who get that and can understand the impact of that on you as a person. The reason that we can empathize is because we have mirror neurons in our brain. And these are the neurons that help us to learn language and imitate motions and understand others' intentions. Some people have more of an ability to tune in to other people and have more ability to empathize than others, but all brains have that ability. So it's after lunch, hopefully you've had some food, you're thinking about a nap. So here's your mirror neurons at work. All right, so we don't really have the ability to poll all of you to say how many of you yawned during that little demonstration. But if you did, that's your mirror neuron. Here we go again. Let's take a look at some pictures. So here we have the door shutting, but here we have the door shutting on the finger. Here we have the door scraping across the foot. Oh, wow. Here we have the knife taking off the thumb. So some of you may be noticing kind of a reaction in your gut, like, oh, God, awful. That's your mirror neurons tapping in, experiencing the experiencing of another, but all you're doing is looking at it, okay? So think if you were experiencing it. And this is the point, that just by watching other people struggle or be in distress or having bad things happen to them, we too are affected. The interesting thing about empathy is if you look at the brain pictures here, here's two foreheads looking at each other, you have areas of the brain where empathy happens are the same areas of the brain that the brain picks up and registers pain. So if you're in the type of a situation where you have a lot of exposure to other people's uglies and bad things in life, then there's food for thought about how that may be also become fatiguing. And people may experience physical pain and backaches and migraines and gastrointestinal distress simply from this secondary traumatic response that we have from empathizing. So how listening impacts us is in a lot of different ways. I mean, there's the verbal message that we listen to. There's the images that form in our brain. There's our feelings and affect. Our body responds to, as we know, with the fight or flight response, that can release different chemicals such as cortisol, which tends to fatigue us if it is released for too much for too long. Also, all of this is interfaced with our interpersonal lives and the support that we have both at work as well as home and in our social life. The other thing that we noticed is with the trauma literature is that at times over the longer-term exposure to secondary trauma is that our assumptions begin to be impacted. Typically, if people are not exposed to a lot of trauma that other people experience or trauma themselves, they tend to believe that the world is still somewhat benevolent. I mean, that bad things happen, but they happen overseas or to other people, not particularly to me, and that there's some meaning to it. So that when bad things happen, it is the gang, that member that gets shot, or the person that wasn't protecting themselves, or, there's some reason for it. You notice this in the media whenever there's some type of a mass shooting. For days and days and days, they're trying to figure out what is the meaning of that event. So for us to ascribe meaning to it is important because it can help us to settle down somewhat in our brains and think, okay, now I know why that happened, so now I need to know what to do to protect myself. The other issue is the self is worthy, so that if I'm a good person, people aren't going to do bad things to me. But when you work in the field of law, and particularly, in criminal defense or prosecution or, like I said, with families, and what you find out is that, it really doesn't have to be meaningful. Sometimes people just hurt other people and awful things happen for no reason. And that can trouble us. It's harder for our brains to settle with that. It's easier for us to develop anxiety or depression as we see that in the world. And the other thing that can happen is continual exposure. We begin to have different assumptions about our lives, about our own safety or the safety of our children, our loved ones, security, trust in the system. We begin to question whether there is any good place anymore. So you can see where depression and irritability, even physical illness sets in with people that have long-term exposure to secondary trauma, and a heightened awareness of our own vulnerability, where we really stop caring, and we may begin to isolate ourselves. One attorney talked about it like this. I think it happens to everybody, whether they admit it or not, show it. It's inevitable with that kind of caseload that at least at times you go bonkers. It wears on some of us more than others. We see colleagues severely affected. I think the practice can leave scars. Some make it better than others, but everybody suffers. I remember coming and talking with a district attorney here in Wisconsin at one time, and he said, Linda, sometimes I walk into this office and I look around and it looks like an emergency department. He said staff just looks so depleted, just like they are in need of some kind of care. And that's the impact of doing this work over and over without the understanding of how it can impact us as human beings and how to put a plan in place for prevention and mitigation. So as we look at the impact upon practitioners, we often see this sense of powerlessness. It really doesn't matter what I do. It's going to turn out the same anyway. Attorneys can report being indecisive or feeling anxious or irritable and begin to alienate themselves from other people. So you see that spending time around others that understand your work and can empathize with it will help replenish and restore you. So if attorneys are alienating from other people, they're going in the opposite direction of what they need to be doing in order to improve or maintain their health and wellness. So as you look back and you think about how you filled in the blanks, the question that I would have for you, and the one that is important, is how have the answers to these questions changed since you started working as a lawyer? What would you have said 20 years ago if you've been in practice for that long or more, or 10 years ago? I mean, have they changed? And if they have, what do you think about that? Do you see how you have been impacted, your assumptions about the world and yourself may have been impacted by the work that you do? Now, the last time I did this presentation, I had an attorney say, well, Linda, what does it mean if I have the same answer for every blank. And I said, well, I don't know. What is the answer? And he said, shitty. And I said, well, that's probably not good, so you need to see me after this presentation, and, we'll talk about it. So, and, he was being a little facetious, but he was just telling the truth. He said, my assumptions have changed, and I really have found myself becoming rather negative and pessimistic about my life and my job and just kind of the meaning of all of that. So the symptoms that are typically reported fall under the same lines as those very similar to post-traumatic stress. You'll see that people report having intrusive thoughts about their cases. Maybe they're at home and they're relaxed and they're, not thinking about work, and all of a sudden that case pops into their head, where they may be going to put their child to bed, and all of a sudden that case about child abuse has come to them. And so, it's just intrusive thoughts that they may wake up in the middle of the night and they're thinking about that case. They can't get it out of their mind and think, why am I thinking about that now? It doesn't have any relevance to me now. So changes in our mood, we see, with anger, anxiety, or fear, irritability. People have problems with their sleep, have problems with fatigue, a whole kind of list of things that can impact us, that loss of empathy, of just not caring anymore and not feeling like what you do makes a difference. The other thing is that often the body will keep the score. The body will start to talk back to you and say, if you're not going to listen to me, I'm going to get your attention until you start making some changes to replenish and restore yourself. How we've seen this interface with discipline, now this is in Wisconsin here, we looked at what are most people complaining about to their in regards to their attorney. And, the most complaints were in the area of lack of diligence and improper advocacy and misrepresentation. But where misconduct most often is found year after year after year is in this lack of communication, where attorneys are not keeping up with their ethical responsibilities for communications with their clients. In the Judicial Commission, the subjects of informal resolution most often was for intemperate courtroom conduct. When you look at depressed and overwhelmed lawyers, don't tend to communicate very well. If they're struggling, if they're not sleeping, if they're having intrusive thoughts, or they're having anxiety or irritability, we see this, the research shows it, the Journal of Legal Ethics talks about how depression is a significant factor in lawyer discipline. If people don't keep up with how they are impacted by the work that they do, they can become impaired to a point where, when you look at this rule, promptly inform the client, reasonably consult, keep the client reasonably informed, promptly comply. These are difficult things to do when someone isn't sleeping, isn't feeling good, isn't able to get into the office, is isolating, pulling away from their work, and they start not to owe up to what they need to be doing on their cases with their clients. And this is when some of the grievances get filed. Here's a disciplinary case with neglect. This isn't as unusual in some ways, where an attorney opened a private practice and took in just any amount of work that the person could get, did not set up a good practice, didn't have a legal assistant or anyone assisting, and became overwhelmed from working around the clock, and his health began to deteriorate. His mental health began to deteriorate. And he had resulting problems with communication and diligence, and ended up with a 60-day suspension. So you can clearly see how these things get linked together. In regards to the rules for competence and diligence, if attorneys are doing too much for too long and not working to replenish and restore themselves, it can impact that competent representation and diligence. Here's a case law in regards to diligence, where this attorney was clearly not well. This attorney was affected by physical and psychological problems. The court noted that, but also noted that even though the circumstances mitigate the misconduct, the expectation is still that attorneys must attend to their clients, should have pulled out, should have gotten other attorneys involved. So, you know, what we notice is that at times it's very difficult when you are really impaired to think about what you need to be doing. Oh, I shouldn't be on this case. I need to turn this. I need to get another attorney involved. I need to take a medical leave. In the lawyer assistance world, that's part of our function is to assist attorneys to realize that they are impaired and that a medical leave would be a good thing, and it is time to turn over cases. So we try to get there ahead of time in a preventative way so that we don't end up with these types of violations. Because at a point where there is that level of impairment, we don't have people thinking logically and proactively. So you can see where if we're not careful with our stress levels and we keep on taking on more and taking on more and stress keeps going up, we have this relationship where the level of impairment also rises, and then discipline comes into play at some point here. And for us, it's just, you know, a big headache that is hard to dig out from. I'm going to say a few words about mitigating compassion fatigue, and then I'm going to turn this over to Deb and have her talk about this from an organizational response and what we actually did with our research study. And Greg is going to go into more depth in regards to what health and wellness for attorneys. So mitigating compassion fatigue on a lot of different levels, people need to be putting in place individual accommodations for themselves, as well as professional, thinking about what they need to be doing within their work and their work environment and their colleagues. It can also be helpful for people to be involved on a societal level, whether they join focus groups or something that can impact the culture, the nature of the practice that they are involved in, where they feel like they're making a difference. So there are things that attorneys can do to take a look at these issues and begin to go towards them. You know, the self-awareness is probably your greatest tool. I mean, here you are as a young attorney and, you know, bopping along and just starting out and really excited about the practice. And then you run into the barbed wire fences of life, right? Because we all have the barbed wire fences. They're always there. We're all going to have to negotiate them, but how we choose to negotiate them, attorneys who reach out, ask for assistance, get connected with their peers, utilize their lawyer assistance program, seek other services or resources, it's a little easier to be handling the barbed wire fence. Not as many prongs, they're not as sharp, and hopefully you prevent ending up here, you know, which is in that impaired state or within discipline. The organizational contributions to compassion fatigue also have to be looked at. You know, and these are the heavy caseloads and the inefficient administration and the paperwork. So these are things that you need to think about. Are these also on my wall? You know, are these dots on my wall? The lack of supportive supervision is really critical. This is something that can impact you more than inefficient administration or even long hours, because the importance of having supportive supervision forms a bond amongst workers where people feel they're understood, that people know how difficult the work is, and at least they've got the support to do it. So this is one, if you are a manager, an administrator, to really be going at that for your attorneys that you are working with that are in these types of situations where they're high demand and limited resources. The other things that can be very helpful for you, today you're doing one of them, implementing education, becoming trauma-informed, knowing how the trauma exposure impacts you, and finding a way to debrief via connections with other people who can empathize with you. Because through debriefing, the brain gets better. It can actually heal. So, and I don't mean getting together and talking about the cases and what you could have done differently and what different legal tactics could have been used. When I say debrief, I mean talking about how this case impacted you as a person. Did you feel anger from it? Did you lose sleep over it? What did you experience and what was the impact upon you? Was it just that you never even got a chance to think about it because you had to move right on to the next case? Debriefing is very important for the brain. It's important for the healing process. It allows emotions to get out of the midsection of the brain into your prefrontal cortex where you can ascribe meaning and context to them. So critical activity for attorneys to be engaging in. And lastly, just in summary, here's some of the research-based suggestions in summary format to really recognize the risks for yourself. Understand the environment that you're in and the cases that you have. What we found in our research study is that between workload and exposure to other people's trauma, the exposure to other people's trauma was the primary factor driving anxiety, depression, chronic conditions, as well as affecting attorneys' ability to have quality leisure time. So it was really that exposure element. So be aware of it and recognize the cases and how much exposure you have to secondary trauma. And then find a way to debrief that material. And you have to work on it every day because self-awareness is your greatest tool. How am I impacted by this? How am I thinking about it? How am I behaving towards it? What kind of support systems am I putting in place? Every day taking an inventory. What do I need to get off my plate? What can I delegate? How is my sleep patterns, my appetite, my exercise patterns? So what am I doing to help myself? Evaluate your tension-reducing behaviors, okay? We all reduce tension. We all have tension. Some of us overwork, overeat, overdrink, oversleep, overexercise. When you evaluate it, you're asking yourself, are the ways that I reduce tension, do they help me more than hurt me? Really important. And the last thing I'd say is to just really think about being intentional about protecting yourself. Pulling back from material, not looking too long, not going back to it over and over again, limiting your exposure. When you come home at night, don't watch CSI and Law and Order SVU and, other trauma inputs. Try to protect yourself from that, from the trauma input into your life. It can make a difference in regards to the brain functioning and the impact upon your psychological and physical and emotional well-being. So at this point, I'm going to pass the baton over to Deb Smith. What we did here in Wisconsin is we decided to form a collaboration several years ago and study the impact of secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue upon criminal defense attorneys. So Deb is going to give us a review of that and the results of that study.
Thank you, Linda. I'm Deb Smith. I retired 2 years ago after 32 years with the Wisconsin State Public Defender. When I started law school, I didn't know at all what kind of law I wanted to practice, but the one thing I did know is that I did not want to do criminal law. I thought I wasn't mean enough to be a prosecutor, and the idea of being responsible for the outcome of a client was just too overwhelming. Of course, the way the universe works, that's exactly where I ended up. 2 years passed in law school and 1 summer clinical program doing misdemeanor defense, and I was hooked. The work was exciting and challenging. It felt good to be an advocate for someone who could not advocate for themselves. Courtroom work, especially trials, had all the draw of an extreme sport. You against an opponent, the adrenaline rush, the focus. On the other hand, I also got strep 4 times in my first year of practice. And I did this cases full-time for 20 years. I flew solo on my first homicide case in just my 4th year. And over time, caseloads increased. We had the war on drugs with mandatory sentences. Prosecutions increased dramatically for domestic violence and sexual assault. So over time, the excitement of being the advocate and the excitement of being in court lessened. It seemed like we had so much more work and so many fewer options. Eventually, I moved into a full-time management position. I did this in part because I wanted to have a seat at the table where decisions were made for the agency, but also in part because I was becoming increasingly afraid that I could no longer perform for clients at the level I was used to. Of course, I didn't tell anyone about my fears. I didn't even really admit those feelings to myself at the time. I just thought if I had to perform, I would just suck it up and do it. When Linda Albert first spoke to a group of our agency leaders about the issue of compassion fatigue, the information she shared was just simply amazing to me. For me and others, hearing about secondary trauma and compassion fatigue was a revelation. Someone had seen what we go through and then showed it to us so that we would see it too. I think that many or most of us knew that there was a price for doing what we were doing, and we could feel the drain, but we didn't look at it much, and we didn't name it, and we certainly didn't talk about it. And this was especially true, I think, for women lawyers of my generation. It was presumed when I started practice with the public defender that if they were hiring a woman lawyer, they were hiring her to do juvenile court. And so when we had the first couple lawyers come in who were not doing juvenile court, who were doing real cases, there was a lot of testing and a lot of watching to see, well, can she really hack it? So, if you were having thoughts and feelings about reading the endless reports on sexual assault or domestic battery, you certainly wouldn't talk about that with most of your peers. By the time Linda came to speak to us, I was a member of the senior management team, and when Linda suggested that we collaborate to do a study, I pushed the idea with our team. Fortunately for me, the Wisconsin State Public Defender has always been a leader in innovative practices within both state government and the criminal justice system, and I was allowed to carry this project forward. It was also helpful that most of our senior managers had come from the ranks and knew the stresses firsthand. They may not have wanted to acknowledge the issues or talk about them, but they did not resist the push to investigate the problem through a study. We also had an advantage for doing this study because we were a statewide organization. It would have been difficult to do this kind of study with prosecutors in Wisconsin because they were run on a county-by-county basis by the elected district attorneys. The study were some of our first steps at becoming what is sometimes now called a trauma-informed organization. And that's an organization that is aware of the potential for impairment due to secondary trauma and compassion fatigue and takes steps to educate staff about the risks and ways to mitigate the effects the work can have. This is part of our duty as lawyers, especially if you are a supervising lawyer or manager or managing partner. Impairment at some point has an impact on lawyer competence. And for most of us, we aspire to provide more than mere competence. If you want the lawyers in your firm, or if you are the only lawyer in your firm, you need to provide those lawyers with the information they need to continue to perform at the level expected in your practice. Aspirational goals aside, we also have duties as supervising attorneys to make sure that our subordinate lawyers meet the requirements of the rules of professional conduct. Linda has already gone through a couple of example cases of how impairment due to secondary trauma and compassion fatigue can result in disciplinary actions. But I would suggest to you that it is also neither humane nor a good business model to simply use subordinate lawyers until they are too damaged to continue. I want to talk a little bit about how we set up the study and how we promoted the study. Although I think it's unlikely that any of you will end up conducting or participating in this kind of study, the process we use to introduce the study to our staff and get their cooperation could be helpful for any firm or organization who wants to talk about this subject in staff meetings and training programs. First, we made it totally legitimate and as impressive as possible. Lawyers are very quick to discount a project if the person running it or the design is questionable. So we partnered with Linda Albert at the WISLAP program at the State Bar, and we collaborated with a researcher from New York State who had done previous studies and published on the subject. The study format went through medical and academic review committees to make sure that it was properly set up and legitimate. We addressed the lawyers in our agency, their concerns about confidentiality, and we did a few introductory programs on the subject, hoping to get good word of mouth from staff. Staff attorneys in our agency are assigned on average about 300 cases a year. Plus they have intake duties and jail check duties and the paperwork that goes along with the practice of law and employment by a governmental body. It took a certain amount of nerve to ask them to do this one more thing. Please respond to the surveys. The keys to our success in getting overburdened staff to respond at an extraordinarily high rate were things like leadership from the executive level. This meant not only communication from me, but from the other division directors and the state public defender. It also required leadership at the regional and local levels. Regional and local office managers talked to staff about the survey and encouraged participation. We were also able to get the attorneys' union president to endorse the study. And we got a few especially respected peers, the attorneys throughout the organization that often presented at trainings or were known to handle high-profile cases or be particularly successful trial attorneys. They also endorsed the study. We repeated the message and the importance of the study many times preceding and during each cycle of surveying. And on this slide, we have a list of the messages that we would send out prior to a round of surveying and during the surveying. And we had pretty consistently about 75% response rate to a survey, which is very high for surveying. We used established and validated survey instruments. This information was in the introductory page on the survey, talking about tools of surveying for these issues that had been used in the past and determined to be valid studies and studies that we could could use to compare our results. And once we began the surveying, we also began training. Linda went above and beyond to provide day-long training about secondary trauma and compassion fatigue and ways to mitigate that. We ended up doing regional trainings. I think we did 10 regional trainings each day long for staff. And staff participation was encouraged but not mandatory. And we got some variation in response. Generally, people responded very positively, very strongly. They were really happy to see that people were recognizing the struggles that they went through. But we did get some of the responses from those lawyers that said, "Oh, this is a bunch of crap. Just man up and do your job." But by and large, staff was grateful for the information and that the agency cared about them and the effects of the work on their jobs. The other thing that we were able to do through the regional trainings was to collect the thoughts and feelings and ideas from staff around the state. It helped immensely that they felt listened to and that we cared about the issues that they were bringing forward. And besides the items that we were specifically surveying for, they brought up other issues that made their work life difficult that was useful information for agency managers. Besides the training, Linda also began providing weekly email tips and reminders about keeping themselves balanced and healthy, and I think that was helpful, to remind them that, as she said, you need to do this with some intention and do it on a daily basis. As I mentioned, we had an initial survey response of 74%. We surveyed every 3 months for a year, and we continued to have a high rate of response to the survey. And eventually, somebody took away all of the data that was collected through the surveying and did whatever magic with numbers that they do with these things. And we got results back, which confirmed that our attorney staff were at significant risk for depression, PTSD, secondary trauma, stress, and burnout. The results also indicated that almost 3/4 of our attorneys had clinically significant functional impairment in their non-work lives as a result of their jobs. That would be, strains on relationships with spouses, significant others, children, friends, all the things that you do outside of work. They were showing signs of impairment. But at the same time that we're finding that our attorneys are showing significant social impairment and they're at risk for depression and PTSD, we didn't have high rates of turnover. In fact, we had very low rates of turnover. We weren't having widespread disciplinary problems with attorneys or reports of rampant substance abuse or abnormal behavior. So what was going on? The study and the training sessions showed that our staff was actually pretty good at finding ways to mitigate the effects of the work. The study and training sessions also showed that people that chose to become a public defender and work with our agency, that it was something about that sense of purpose, that the work was in line with their core values when they sought work for the public defender, provided some protection as well. And overall, I would say what the study did for us and the staff, it gave staff information about secondary trauma and compassion fatigue and gave them tools for mitigating the effects. It gave staff permission to acknowledge and talk about how the work makes them feel. It convinced senior leadership, and this is the most important thing and the thing I'm most proud of having gone through this, is convinced our senior leadership that even though we didn't have money for it in the budget, we needed to contract with a real employee assistance program. So the bottom line with this stuff for me is, who takes care of the caretakers? We had gone through years of training in our agency about how attorneys needed to be more client-centered in their approach to cases, to listen to clients and to empathize and be compassionate with clients. And through this study, it became clear that there was a new role or an enhanced role for supervisors and managers, and that was to be staff-centered, to look at being as supportive as we were demanding, that we needed to protect those who needed and wanted to take care of themselves, and to treat colleagues with as much compassion and understanding as we did with clients. And I think that it was an important lesson for us to learn that while we resented the unfair judgments of some prosecutors and judges about our clients, some of us were making unfair judgments about colleagues who had found themselves overwhelmed, depressed, or stressed out, and we needed to show empathy and compassion to our colleagues just like we did with our clients. I'm now going to turn this over to Dr. Van Rybroek, and he's going to tell you how to be happy. Greg?
Thank you. So let's go to the next slide here and transition to a nice dovetail from Deb's final points about the study. There's a new study out, a national study by Krieger and Sheldon, that in some ways reflects what Deb was saying about having a sense of control and being involved with our peers and job competency. And you can read the rest. All of these facets are important to lawyer happiness. Now, the rest of what I'm going to talk about is a little bit more abstracted, because I want to sneak up on all of you audience members, and the goal for me is to see if anything lasts in this talk. And I'll never know, and you'll only know, because most of what gets talked about in a CLE presentation like this can easily slip away because of the demands of life. And if any of it lasts, then I, for one, am pleased. Part of that is to agitate you a little bit about topics like happiness. If it was easy, we'd all take a pill, wouldn't we? And we would have done that long ago. And if we actually had one that worked, we'd at least be on midnight TV selling it. So the truth of the matter is we don't have an injection of all better. If there was, I would be the first one in line. And if there was any left, I might share. In fact, we human beings are not old in terms of life altogether, which is estimated to be billions of years, but in human existence, we are 3 to 4 million years old, and it's important to think about that with perspective. So Copernicus helped us understand we are not the center of the universe. Darwin helped us understand we are only a twig on the branches of life, and we really, as human beings, are fairly young life forms, and we have spent many millions of years simply learning to survive on the savanna. I offer this now because it is a shot at trying to give us perspective. So what is survival? So these are just little scales here talking about our brains. So we think about, let me see if I can get this pointer working. Click pointer, I can't tell. I hope the pointer can be seen, I'm not sure. But up on the left side you'll see food, and on the right side you'll see sex. And human beings are interested in survival that way, and as such, they need dopamine in their brains. And our brains want us to simply survive, and when food or sex is put in front of us for survival's sake, we will do it. In fact, there is little to show right now exactly where the happiness lobe is in the brain. There are parts of the brain that seem to be related to happiness, but our brains aren't really geared to help us become more happy. Rather, they're just trying to regulate us. So our brains spend time helping us breathe, helping us remember that we have to eat, helping us procreate. Once we get there, and I would submit that most of us who are on the line right now are in the feeling safe condition, then we get into this trickier stuff, harder to hold in your hand stuff, called happiness. And these are about life's pleasures and desires, and they become part of the prominent parts of our thinking process. And the action starts with our brain, so going back to our primitive brain, we are actually in possession of a brain that doesn't care if we are involving drugs in moving that dopamine or involving exercise. It simply is interested in the movement of the gushing neurotransmitters between one synapse and the other. We simply want that. Our brain likes that, but it doesn't actually have a stake in the race. So if it's an unhealthy decision, take drugs, or a healthy decision, something like exercise, our brain is impassive, neutral, just happy that it's happening our way. So there's a lot of research now that shows a different part of our brain helps us feel happy and is activated through music. So there's enough research out there that shows that when we listen to music, our mood improves, and what that basically means is we have some gushing neurons and neurotransmitters there with dopamine involved, helping us feel good. This is why music sometimes gets us interested, excited, creates moods, and makes us pine for more. And in the same way, if we think about exercising, simple walking, and if we look at the brain on the left, we can see what the brain looks like sitting quietly. But after a 20-minute walk, the brain lights up all over the place because of the exercise. And the exercise, therefore, is helpful to us when we try to figure out how to spend our time in terms of happiness. Now, one might think, well, our brain is invested in happiness. It's not really, so I'm not going to read this whole slide. It really is reacting as though we're being chased by some wild beast on the savanna, and it's kicking in our brain chemicals in order to help us survive. But we, since we are more advanced after 4 million years, feel better about it because we notice physically and psychologically an improvement, particularly if we sustain the exercise work, which we have to, unfortunately, at times continue to escalate because the endorphins habituate. This slide just is to show that we are born with genetic throws, just like we have good and bad, more purely medical with genetics. We also seem to be getting a little bit closer in the neuroscience frontier of understanding which parts of the brain reflect positive and negative frames of mind, and also science that shows that dopamine is important for us, and that people who are more sensitive to dopamine are actually more cheerful. And we can go all the way now to little bitty babies and see that they look different one by one. All of this demonstrating that our brains, the whatever ones we got from mom and dad and from their mom and dad and so forth, actually have a lot to do with our outlook and our biology today. But we're not all to be lost here. Brain plasticity means the ability to change the brain, plastic, to bend it, to mold it, to make it malleable. And there's a lot of study now in the world of meditation and mindfulness, sometimes reflected through the brain scans of Buddhist monks that show practice with clearing the mind and meditation helps us have more brain activity in that positive side, the left prefrontal cortex. It's good news. Another way to think about it is the model of set points. So if you look at this slide, we can see that about 50% of our mental makeup, our brain, is just the throw of genetics. So some would say there's nothing you can do about that. So don't fight what nature has given you, good and bad. It's not in your control. Fortunately, the rest of our lives and how we spend our time and our attitude and our circumstances are somewhat in our control, and that should be good news for us because we have a shot at grabbing the wheel when in some areas we can't. Let's pick on mood for a second. So right about now, if you just follow the orange here, we should all be experiencing the best mood of the day around now. But then look at the blue one underneath. We can see that as our mood goes down over time, our negative emotions go up right around the time we might get home and our kids have decided to fall apart and our spouse isn't there, and the dog has done bad things in the house, et cetera, et cetera. We can see how relationships start to fray when we simply run out of energy and certainly have to work harder on getting a positive emotion out of ourselves. And then using mood again, we always say, or often we hear, people are working toward the weekend. And if we ask people, well, when do you feel best? So we're looking here at the green. A lot of enjoyment is Saturday and Sunday. If there's more time, I'd show you other slides to try to answer what that is about. One is that Saturday and Sunday we have more time for relationships, for friend and family. But if we had even more time, I'd talk about the goal for all of us could be it's Monday through Friday. That's an awful lot of time to simply accept that we are full of stress and worry and settle for that. We would be able to, with thought and planning, do better at times. Here are an interesting series of slides to offer perspective. So let me just orient you to the slides. The left axis here, going up, are mood measures, so surveys about happiness, and then down on the bottom is the years. So if we think about ourselves, take a marriage relationship, we have a building up of happiness from 4 years to the year 0, you could see, which is the marriage point. But then I guess society sometimes helps us believe or frame up that life should improve. Why would we get married if we didn't think life would improve? But sadly or realistically, life gets harder. Not because marriage itself, out of hand, is bad, but because we as human beings habituate to each other, even to our spouses. And so that's why after the marriage point, the survey results from many people go down in terms of their life satisfaction. It isn't to say that life sucks, but it is to say that it defies some of our best hopes that life will just simply improve as though it's a straight line up. It isn't so. And then there's other interesting information. Take divorce. Obviously, as folks are going through tension in their life and things are getting worse, things go down all the way to the divorce point when there is some sense of relief after the trauma. But then look at the years after. Life actually gets better there, which offers us some realistic hope for when things get bad. Widowhood is particularly difficult. You can see the massive dip at the point of death of the spouse. But then look at how we basically bounce back to about the same and a little bit higher in terms of our happiness about 5 years out. And then the birth of a child, we wait for the birth of a child. It's exciting, it's life-changing, it's different than anything else. But, of course, anybody who is a parent and has children now, unlike the anticipation of a child, realizes that it's an awful lot of work and anxiety and stress and unpredictability, and so the measure of happiness can go down, not to the tank point, but it levels off. You can see it plateauing out 5 years out. Finally, this one is interesting, unemployment. It's bad to be unemployed, goes without saying, but looking at the unemployment point, now in the middle, the zero, losing one's job and not gaining a job keeps us pretty well in the low point zone. So the other slides, marriage, divorce, birth of a child, widowhood, all show recovery, but unemployment that is sustained doesn't show recovery. It shows you the value of work, even though we can at times not have that point of view if we are working. Money is elusive. It's the idea that it is the way to get our happiness needs met. But this little slide shows us that no matter how much money you make, and we can see from 1957 to 2005 that as people made more money, their happiness level, which is the straight line underneath, pretty much stayed the same. If happiness and money had a better correlation, of course, the lines would parallel, moving upward as the amount of money increased, but they don't. Trying to make the point here that money in and of itself is not going to solve the happiness question. It may, some of the latest research shows that it helps with comfort, but comfort is limiting. Comfort is really going to stop at some point, and happiness doesn't result out of comfort alone. This is my favorite in some ways because I happen to be a mind wanderer, I will admit. And a mind wanderer is not always a happy mind because it is dizzying and aimless and meandering in a way that isn't helpful to the cause of meaning and happiness. If we can get our mind to be focused on the event at hand, the work that needs to be done, the other person on the other side of us, the measurement of happiness goes up dramatically from the ambling, meandering mind. Flow. Flow is that in-between space on any activity that we're doing, and this time I mean activities of work or play, work and life, that is not so hard that we can't do it, making us feel defeated and anxious and so forth, and not so easy that we can do it, making us feel bored. It's that in-between space between our abilities and the action that we're interested in, the event itself. Carl Wallenda had a great line, life is being on the wire. Everything else is just waiting. For Wallenda aficionados, you know that he actually fell off a high wire to his death. But if we could have stopped him just before he hit the bottom and said to him, Carl, what are you thinking? He probably would have said something to the effect of, I died doing what I like to do. That's the only way I felt alive anyway, being on the wire. I'm not suggesting high wire walking for anybody who's not interested here. I'm saying the point is what we are interested in doing is what helps us feel better about life because we feel absorbed in it and we feel a different sense of time. Now let's take time, which is on the lower axis here, time against happiness, which is on the vertical line. If the wellness research is of any help to us, it says the pleasure bones of happiness are actually available to us, but we're only going to be happy to a certain degree then, and if we move up into the flow area, which is doing things that we like to do because we're interested in it regardless of whether it's interesting to anybody else, it's interesting to us, that would be the mid-level area of happiness. But striving for a higher purpose, which is sometimes summarized as altruism, doing something for somebody else is over and over again shown through the research. So I'm not proselytizing this to you. I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to just use the research as the way to reach a better degree, a higher degree, a more sustained happiness, something outside of ourselves. Because as humans, we are naturally selfish if we are trying to survive. And that primitive brain is trying to help us become more involved with pleasure and doesn't, again, have that much concern about flow or higher purpose. That's something that's more in our hands. In fact, our society and our culture pushes us at sometimes to try to work and work and work so that we can stop work, to do nothing. but our brains are simply not oriented to doing nothing. Our brains are actually oriented toward doing something much more meaningful when we are the 4 million-year-old human. So we are really in the lucky camp. Again, if we are past the survival on the bottom and up into the world of self-actualization, which is to, I suppose, work hard at trying to live a life that's worth living, and that becomes harder because there are no easy answers and no magic pills to take. And the ennui of life is actually something that becomes very difficult for us. It's the slow drip, drip, drip of those of us who are far past survival but are living in a world where we have to figure out what it means to us. That can become very, very difficult because of its tenacious nature at just trying to help us survive. So let's say you're sitting there in the United States right now, and secretly you know that you want to make things change and you want to do better and you want to get happier, and you're still hoping in the last 5 minutes from me that I'm going to give you the secret. I've already told you I don't have it, but let's use the research for a second. I'm not going to read all of these, but if you wanted to slowly look at this later, you could feel supported by knowing there is research behind every one of these bullets. Let's just pick on the first one, expressing gratitude. This research says if you remember your favorite grade school teacher, friend, neighbor, confidant, mentor, who actually helped you somewhere in your life when things weren't going well or guided you when you needed it, and actually found them on Facebook or wrote them a note or stopped in to tell them that it will make you happy. It will help you because you have gone out of your way to recall that they needed to be thanked for their work and their efforts toward you. And again, if there was more time, we could spend some of it on these bullets. Similar, this slide is a little bit more practical, but it's all supported by science of what we can do if we actually are serious about wanting to become happier. And again, I can't go through all of this given time. Tendency with all human beings is to blame somebody else. The trouble is out there, the people in my life, the systems in my life, the person who cut me off out in the grocery line, and that sort of thing. But if I had you in shrink land, I would try to nudge you toward, well, let's think about your hand and whether your hand has anything to do with it. And if you had me in shrink land, you'd quickly hear me say, well, I want to control everything. And I'm just interested, I actually wish that human beings had knobs on them, the ones that were around me, and I could just turn them off or turn them down or turn them on in ways that would be good for me. And these are control issues that we all have, and obviously we can't manage because we can't get that done. So the battle for control is fruitless much of the time, and it's one where we have to sort out whether we can or cannot control something. Very easy to say this on a Wednesday afternoon, but not easy to do in real life. Finally, the last couple of slides. What is very stressful for us is to put ourselves or allow ourselves to remain in the false personal positions, sucking up to the boss or to other people and not saying the real truth because we are afraid or concerned about the reaction and all the various reasons. This is very stressful. And we have to do this to a certain amount because we need to get along with people just to make it through daily life. But the more we're in the false position, the more stressed we are because we realize the hypocritical side of ourselves that is trying to simply make it, but it's not our true self. It's the one that is falsely positioned and causing stress. So we'd like to reduce that if possible. And this one is our internal world. I often talk about what we are thinking behind our face. So this is, because it's a slide presentation, really meant to express that if we have an internal life behind our face that looks like these two faces expressing hostility, it's an awful difficult, hard slog every single day and every moment and every day to walk through life because we basically are super unhappy and either revealing it, as these folks are, or secretly harboring it like many do, and it is really, really difficult to get out of it without some sort of help in some in some fashion. Finally, you really want to change? Well, got to get to this point here. If we want it to happen, whatever that change is, then we got to want it to happen real bad. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. It's just too hard. And if it's too hard, then it has to be let go, because not letting it go is so stressful and self-destructive that life just gets worse. Mind wandering is something that I've already talked about, and when our mind wanders, we sometimes have minds, particularly if we are the negative sort, that does these words: worrying, regretting, complaining, perseverating, and comparing, when we really want to have minds that are thinking about what's going on right now. So Lennon captures it well. Life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans. Well, we don't get a second shot at this life, so it's all happening and then it's done, boiling down to this main point. We're all going to die, and understanding death and realizing it in a way that can help us recognize that how we spend our time is critically important to our happiness becomes part of any secret that there might be. We don't know how much time we have, and that's probably fortunate, because that would mess us up and make it difficult, considering that we would have an actual endpoint that we're aware of. But this is the tricky one for all of us. What are we thinking about behind our eyeballs when we're doing other things, and is that in any way quantifiable, and is there a way to make it real such that we can do more of that? Because I would submit that often what we're thinking about is what we wish we were doing, but we can't because of other things that are going on in life. Finally, I don't know how old anybody is out there, but this is survey research that shows happiness on the left axis. The higher the number, the more happiness. So if you are 41, between 41 and 50, your life is sucking the most right now. And so if you are younger than that, then you have this to look forward to. But if you are over 50, then your life should be improving by the research. And so the point is we ought to be smiling. Thanks.
Thank you, Greg. Okay. We're now ready to begin taking questions from our live audience. So the attendees can submit questions via the chat feature on the webinar interface. For those attendees also on the phone, the operator will now provide instructions on how you may ask your questions over the phone. Tammy?
Thank you, Ms. Albert. We are now ready to begin taking questions from our live audience. All attendees can submit questions. If you would like to register for a question, please press the star key followed by the 1 key on your telephone keypad. If your question has been answered and you would like to withdraw your registration, please press star 1 on your telephone keypad. And if you're using a speakerphone, please lift your handset before entering your request. 1 moment, please, for the first question. And while our callers get in line, we will now give you your ABA participation verification code required to receive CLE credit for this program. You'll be asked to enter the code in the online attendance form following this program. The ABA participation verification code is 3, T as in Tango, 1, 4, K as in Kilo, L as in Lima, M as in Mike, 2. That code again is 3, T as in Tango, 1, 4, K as in Kilo, L as in Lima, M as in Mike, 2. And I'll turn it back to you, Ms. Albert, for any questions.
Thank you. We do have a few questions that callers have submitted. The first one says, how do solos get that supportive supervision that we had talked about? I'll take a stab at this first, and then Deb or Dr. Van Rybroek, if you have other thoughts on it. I think it's very difficult for solo practitioners. I know here in Wisconsin, the majority of our attorneys are solo or small firm practitioners. And so we have developed in certain areas mentoring programs through different bar associations where more experienced attorneys volunteer to mentor a younger attorney who is just starting out or someone who is in need of particular type of support. And so I would encourage you to talk to your bar association, look at the Young Lawyers Division, any other resources that might have mentoring programs that you could tap into in order to get that supportive supervision. I know in my own experience with my own professional life, there were times when I did not have it and I did have to pay out of pocket for it. And even getting an hour a month still was helpful. So hopefully practitioners are able to find that, through some type of mentoring program. Deb or Greg, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think being active with your local bar associations it's not exactly supervision, but there will be older, more experienced lawyers that you can set up even an informal mentoring relationship with, and at least you'll be involving yourself with attorneys who understand what you're going through and can, at least acknowledge the difficulties that you're facing. So I found, even though my workload was exceptionally high, that being involved in committees and bar association things, Inns of Court, the state bar, actually gave me more than it required of me in extra time and work.
We have another question, and Dr. Van Rybroek, I think this I would gear this towards you first. The lawyer says, as you've conducted research, was there any consideration of the role of religion and or faith in an individual's happiness? One's deeper religious involvement over the weekend could, it seems, also contribute to the higher happiness scores on Saturday or Sunday. Just wondering if you looked at this.
Yes. Actually, the answer to that question is yes. It doesn't mean, though, just to be clear in terms of the research, that it has to be an organized religion of any particular denomination. But the research shows, and this is consistent support, that spirituality, however that is determined and interpreted in one's own mind, actually is very helpful when it gets to personal happiness and well-being. And this fits well with the idea that if we're moving past pleasure and then moving past our own personal interests, which is fine to have, of course, and moving outside of ourselves and working in the spiritual realm, the research is supportive. So long as what people think about for religion is anything that would be considering what sometimes is called the something more, whatever the something more means to you, gets you outside of your own personal selfish view of or narrow-minded view of life. So the answer to that is yes. And I would just say one more, it's not just the weekends, it's any time of day and any day.
The next question is, when would you recommend a change of career based on symptomatology discussed? I'll start, and then Deb, maybe you can talk about it since you've had a change with your retirement. I think from a clinical perspective, if people are really struggling to a point of not being able to perform their job or have lost their motivation, their willingness to look at ways to do this, consulting with someone who understands secondary trauma would be the first step before you leave your job. I would say get into a treatment provider that understands secondary trauma, get yourself into a support system with other colleagues, such as Deb described, that are going to understand how difficult the work is, and find ways to debrief the material, take things off your plate, start to simplify activities in life, go towards activities that you have no longer engaged in that you used to enjoy, even if it's a 10-minute bike ride or a 5-minute walk. A lot of times people think, I've stopped doing this, and they want to start doing it in the same capacity that they left it. And that just doesn't work for us. So before you change the job, I think you go towards, are there things that I can do that are going to decrease the symptomatology? And if it turns out that that is not true, then in consultation, with your treatment provider, your colleagues, a career coach, sometimes a change of employment can be a very good thing for people.
I would agree with that. And, at some point I look at it as kind of like how you evaluate a close personal relationship. At some point, are you getting much less from it than you are paying or giving? And as Linda said, if you've taken steps to simplify your life, to do the things to take care of yourself, and it's just, you're bailing as fast as you can, but the water is coming in faster, it may be time to look at career alternatives. And I was lucky that at the point at which I really needed to be gone, I was also able to retire. Of course, I had cancer, and I won't say that my job gave me cancer, but it certainly didn't help me prevent cancer. Changing careers, it's not like going to heaven that once you change careers, the whole world is golden and rosy and everything is perfect. You're still you, and you still have your own personality traits and the things that you do that are good for you and the things that you do that are not good for you. So if you're looking at changing careers, that's only going to be may only be part of a solution. If you take all of your bad attitudes and habits with you, it's just going to be the same at the new job. So those are all things to keep in mind.
Okay, the next question we have is John is asking for a summary of the keys to avoid compassion fatigue. So if we're going to summarize that, I guess I would say, first of all, take an inventory and take a look at what is your exposure to other people's distressing stories and events and the type of law that you practice, and be well aware of the exposure element. Take an inventory of the amount of hours that you work and see that those hours are reasonable in order to give you time to engage in home and leisure activities. Find that way to debrief cases and the impact upon cases. Get into some type of a regular activity that allows you to empty out or release tension, whether that is through sports or some type of other activity, that fishing or golfing or whatever it is that helps people to relax and let go, do things that are not on a high intensity level. I think it's difficult for lawyers because they tend to be higher in intelligence. They take on more. They tend to lean towards some perfectionism. So in some ways, it's kind of a setup for them to do the very difficult work and see themselves in a position of being able to do this and take on more of it. I mean, you talk about these murder cases. You know, I've talked with some criminal defense attorneys that that's what they do and that's what they're known for, but the toll on them was just too great. So I think the self-awareness is just really critical. There was another question about, are these issues different for lawyers as opposed to, say, social workers? The only study that I've seen on this was by Andrew Levin, who was a co-facilitator on our compassion fatigue study, and they did show that the lawyers had a higher rate of compassion fatigue than the comparison group of social workers, and primarily looking at because the caseload was so much higher. They had so much more exposure to secondary trauma. Deb or Greg, do you have any other thoughts on that, of why it might be different for lawyers?
Well, I think social workers, that just might be a little bit different, is in social work training, there is more emphasis to understanding compassion fatigue, whereas it's a little bit new for lawyers. It's coming in through talks like this and studies like you were involved in, Linda, and the awareness part of it is sort of something social workers should be ahead of.
And I think it's important to point out that, like with first responders, firefighters, EMTs, police, they're already trauma informed. They're not so much secondary traumas. They're right there with the trauma, but they already have in place, mandatory debriefing from traumatic events. So a lot of organizations in other fields are already way more trauma informed than lawyers.
Absolutely. Okay, we're going to take one more quick question. This is from Elizabeth. When my brother was fighting cancer, I relied on cycling to help me deal with the stress. I was eviscerated by my colleagues as a slacker with too much free time. How can attorneys earn the respect of their colleagues during difficult times?
Lawyers are how lawyers are, and it's hard to give you specific answers not knowing what your work environment is, but again, the culture that you work in your firm is set by leadership, and you need to work on either getting into leadership so that you can change the culture, or educate leaders so that they change the culture, so that when life happens to lawyers, like it's going to happen to anybody, that they can be supportive instead of jerks about it.
Thanks, Deb. Okay, we are out of time, unfortunately. I apologize that we have not been able to get to all of the questions that have been submitted. It's all the time that we have. I will ask the attendees who want CLE credit to stay connected for instructions to get your CLE certificate. To our panelists, Deb Smith and Dr. Van Rybroek, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. On behalf of the ABA, I'm Linda Elbert, thanking you all for joining us. Before leaving, wait for the evaluation to come up on your screen. Thank you. I'll now turn this over to Tammy for some additional information.
Thank you. You can post additional questions or comments on the web board for this program. On behalf of the American Bar Association, the ABA Commission on Lawyer Assistance Programs, Tort Trial and Insurance Practice Section, Commission on Law and Aging, Standing Committee on Legal Aid and Indigent Defendants, SOLO, Small Firm and General Practice Division, and the ABA Center for Professional Development, thank you for participating in this program. To learn more about the sponsors, visit the ABA website at www.americanbar.org. Thank you, and please click on the evaluation link. We value your feedback.